Hi, Sally.
Hi. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I apologize for the reschedule, but it looks like we're going to have a great group. Our state treasurer, Dave Young, had to work on a recovery bill yesterday at the Capitol, and so he's been a very busy person. So I feel very fortunate that he's with us today to talk about some of the tax policies for Colorado and the recovery program, and the bill that he was actually working on just yesterday, and what the progress is on that. I'm going to go ahead and mute all of us, and then if you have any questions, please put it in the chat, and I will get to those. So let me unmute. Maybe. There you go. Yeah. Hi, my name is Sally Boccella, and I am running for Senate District 23. If you'd like to learn more about my community-focused campaign, please visit sallyforcolorado.com. I'd like to welcome our very special guest, Colorado State Treasurer, Dave Young. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Sally. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.
I sure appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about TABOR and Gallagher, and then move on to how we are in a weak safety net predicament, and then on to the recovery program and what the plans are, some of the conversations that the legislature and you have been dealing with in regards to the long bill, the budget. So let's start with TABOR. What, in your opinion, what do you think is the benefits and the burdens of TABOR?
Let me first just say that I think one of the biggest problems we have is the fact that we have conflicting policies in our Colorado Constitution that make it very, very difficult to govern. And so it's not just TABOR, it is Gallagher and Amendment 23, and another provision that's in our Constitution that says that we must have a balanced budget, and I support that, but there's also something in the U.S. Constitution that says we can't print money. So we run into a little bit of a problem here when we have diminishing resources to solve expanding need. And, so I think with TABOR, people were concerned that their taxes were going up too high, that maybe government was growing too much, and that by taking away the ability of legislators to raise taxes without consent of the people was a way to control that. And, it's often been characterized, TABOR, as is the most restrictive tax and expenditure provision of any constitution in the state, in the country. So, I imagine people in other states who have other restrictions might argue that, but I'm not sure they do it successfully. But I do think that people feel like they have some sense of control over their lives as a result of TABOR, and people are really faced. We see it really now more than other times. But anytime we have a downturn and people's finances are really under pressure, knowing that they have some control over the taxes that are going to come out of their finances is, I think, a positive for them. I think the thing they forget about is the fact that when you remove the ability of the legislature to make those decisions, then you must be the most informed voter there is in order to make those decisions. And oftentimes, I ask people when I was on the Joint Budget Committee, I'd say, well, if you really want to understand the situation in the state, you need to come down, sit with me at the Joint Budget Committee. We work about 6 months intensely, and the whole year round. And when we're working intensely, it's 8, 10, 12, sometimes 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we go through that budget line by line and make decisions, multiple decisions sometimes, with deep reporting from our staff. And I said, if you really want to be an informed voter and really have that sense of control over your finances, you need to really understand the state's budget as well to that level, because you're the decision maker. And the Constitution, TABOR, says you're the decision maker. And then I think that that's a plus for people, but I think it's also they forget that, and then sometimes they're blaming the legislature for not putting more money into something, and it's not under the legislature's control to do that. Now they can in fact run a referred measure and get 2/3 vote in each chamber to put something on the ballot and put it in front of the voters to make a change, and but it's still the voters' decision to do that. So that I think that's kind of a hard lesson, and I think sometimes people in elected office don't kind of like to push that back in voters' faces and say, hey, you're the one making decisions here. And it's not a politically wise thing to say, so I can get away with saying it right now. But if I keep saying it, people are going to say, well, why are you blaming us? I mean, because that's what's written into the Constitution. So the positive on that, though, is that these policies that are in there in the Constitution can't be changed by the legislature either. It takes a vote of the people not only to increase taxes, but to affect any change on that. Now, I will say that there was a test title to repeal TABOR that was put in front of the title board. This is the process that people engage in to create an initiative that would go in front of the voters. And so they put, there was a group that put a title to repeal TABOR in its entirety. And that's the first time, even though TABOR's been in the Constitution since 1992, that anybody thought that that could happen. I think there was reluctance because TABOR is so complex, has so many provisions, and touches so many different parts of the Constitution. The prevailing belief was it was going to be ruled as outside the single subject rule in the Constitution, and that multiple initiatives would have to be run. And if some of them passed, some of them failed, we'd have chaos in our Constitution as far as how to enforce tax policy. But this particular title was pretty clean. It just said repeal, I think it's Article 20. Sometimes I get that confused. Is it Title 20, Article 20? I have to go back and look. It's TABOR. And that was challenged. One of the lead challengers, no surprise at all, was Doug Bruce. It was sent all the way up to the Colorado Supreme Court, and the Colorado Supreme Court said, in fact, it was a valid title. So, in fact, this can go on the ballot. It would certainly take a huge campaign and a lot of debate in order to move it forward. And so, I think people are now assessing that political side of it. They've got the technical side that they could make changes to it. But there have been other attempts not to repeal it, but also to just change it as well. So I think, so I'm trying to be fair here. There are, I think, some positives. Having sat on the Joint Budget Committee, really feel like one of the biggest problems we have, and we're really facing that right now, is the fact that the state has the inability to prepare well for downturns in the economy by socking some money away, like people do when they're smart with their own budgets. You save and you put some money away in order to be able to be ready for those rainy days. And we're certainly in the middle of one right now. This is a very severe situation. And people go, well, why can't you just do that? And the problem is that we aren't funding anything in this budget adequately. And when you start talking about putting money aside, when we aren't even meeting essential needs, it's not like we're working on fluff stuff. We're not meeting essential needs at all in any part of our budget. And when you're not doing that, then the demand to put money aside in the face of that is really, really difficult. So we're the only state in the nation that doesn't have a rainy day fund. Every other state in the nation has a rainy day fund. Colorado is the only one, and I attribute that directly to the provision in TABOR that says that any amount that is over the TABOR cap must be refunded to the people. If we were meeting all of our essential needs, people were satisfied that their schools were functioning effectively, that students had good access to higher education, that our transportation systems were well serviced and met the needs of people, that our correctional systems worked effectively, and we weren't over incarcerating. And I mean, I can go down the list of all the different aspects of the budget where I really view us as being a bottom 5 state as far as the delivery of essential services. But if we were really effectively doing that, and we had put an adequate amount of money away in a rainy day fund, I do think that we should return any overage to the voters. I mean, if you've met all the needs, you need to take any excess and return that back. But we haven't met the needs, and we're returning money back. So TABOR has caused that to happen, and we aren't prepared, and we're clearly not prepared for this downturn. So that's I think one of the main. Dave. Yeah, that's one of the major problems.
Well, we have a question in regards to TABOR from Leslie. What about the emergency tax provision in TABOR?
Well, I'm aware that it's there. I think the problem that we see is how do you formulate in an emergency? How do you formulate effective tax policy that doesn't cause many who are in distress further distress? And the problem is this one hit so quickly, and the governor had to declare the emergency, and we're still, I think, reeling under the fact that we haven't solved the health crisis. I know some people believe we have, but I'm not convinced of that. And this crisis is different than others. Others were really a result of like a housing bubble in the 2008, 2009, or a tech bubble in 2001. And then, somebody I've been working with, Blair Richardson, said he's gone back all the way to the recessions in the 1850s and analyzed them. And according to him, he says the ones that are the result or end up with a result of shaking consumer confidence are the toughest ones to deal with. Yeah. And this is certainly one of those. The thing that we're in right now is shaking consumer confidence because people are not sure they can go back into the marketplace. Employees aren't sure they can go back into the marketplace and be safe with their health. And so until we conquer that, I think we're struggling with how to deal with the financial side, which is put a lot of people out of work. We've got a lot of people on unemployment. So are we who are we taxing? It's a very complicated thing. And I think it goes to probably another topic you want to talk about eventually, and that's Gallagher, and there's actually a push to repeal Gallagher. One of the global things I often tell people is that it's one thing to repeal these provisions out of the Constitution. It's yet another thing to talk about, well, what is it going to look like on the other side? What is our tax policy actually going to be? The old saying about, you dance with the devil that brought you, but, maybe you think of TABOR as a devil, maybe you think of it as the best thing that's ever happened. But regardless, at least you know what you have. And the same with Gallagher. If you take those provisions out of the Constitution, what is the tax policy of the state of Colorado going to be? And so in the midst of an emergency, when we start talking about emergency taxes, to move swiftly on a very complicated issue like that, I think is got a lot of risk to it. So I'm not sidestepping it. I know some people that have spent a lot of time studying this. Carol Hedges with the Colorado Fiscal Institute and others have really approached this, but it's really going to take some massive dialogue with people across the state in order to determine that, I think.
So talk to us a little bit about Gallagher and how it conflicts with TABOR.
Sure.
And give us an example that we can understand. And then also talk a little bit about the Gallagher Amendment that's being introduced.
Well, Gallagher actually went into the Colorado Constitution 10 years before TABOR did. And it was a response to exploding residential property tax. And so people really felt like their property taxes on their homes was way too high, and that thought that should be shared with business property tax. Kind of in a 50-50 way. I think it ended up being more of a 45-55 split in principle, but that was essentially, it should be a shared thing, not heavily weighted one way or the other. And so Gallagher went in and it locked in an assessed rate of 29%. I think it may have been 21% for residential, 29% for business to begin with, to make that 55-45 balance work. But the residential property tax in that provision would be allowed, that assessment rate would be allowed to flow up or down depending on what was happening with assessed valuation to maintain the 45-55 split. And I think it probably worked okay at the beginning. You know, there were times where a school district might encounter a problem with assessed valuation in their particular school district, and in order to maintain the level of revenue flow, they might have to float their mill levies up a little bit. But you know, they go to their voters and say, listen, we're gonna change the mill levy, but the actual amount of property tax that you're gonna pay is gonna be unchanged. And, you know, they would have to do some explaining, but people would see that the next time they got their property taxes, that as a result of Gallagher, that some changes to the mill levies had to be made, but that they weren't paying any more tax than they had before. So you know, again, I think that's where people become more comfortable with something, because they see that it actually works, and their property taxes aren't exploding. Their school districts are still getting the revenue that they need. Fire protection districts are still getting the revenue they need. And, you know, library districts, I mean, go down the line of all the districts that are dependent upon that. Where the problem happened is that TABOR didn't contemplate working well with Gallagher. And when TABOR was voted in 10 years later, as we've talked about, the provision in there that says any increase in taxes had to be voted on. When a school district said, listen, we just want to float the mills up, we don't want to change the amount of tax, the proponents of TABOR said, nope, that's an increase in tax. If you change those mill levies, that's an increase in tax, and it's got to go before the people. And of course, then it was harder to explain, and people would go, no, I don't want you to float the mills up. And then we began to see our funding for our schools and other services begin to slide, because again, it takes a lot of time and energy to sit down and really understand these issues to the depth that you need to as a voter in a direct democracy situation. This is not representative democracy. This is voters managing the state's budget one voter at a time collectively. This is a committee of the whole, if I've ever seen one. It's everybody. So, you know, so people would vote no, no, no. Not everybody's doing that. I mean, we've seen successful bond elections and mill levy elections as people have really begun to understand the impact of this. But, you know, generally it's been pretty tough, particularly at the statewide level, to pass any of these things. And that conflict between TABOR and Gallagher is very problematic.
You know, how it was an example that was given to me, which really I could visualize really easily, was with the conflict is, you know, you've got a person who say has, you know, a luxurious home, like let's just say it's $500,000 to $1 million, and they're going to pay less than a small business owner who has, you know, who's paying for 800 square feet. That small business owner is going to be strapped, because that small business owner has now higher property taxes, when it really, there's no, you know, it's not fair. I mean, it's not fair. And I think that when people were thinking about these things, I would like to think that they were thinking about the homeowner, and they were thinking about the business owner as well. Because like you and I have talked about, there's a lot of small business owners that make up Colorado's economy. And right now they're being hit extremely hard, and a lot of them are losing their businesses.
You are absolutely right on that.
Yeah. And so when we talk about the conflict between TABOR and Gallagher, I think it's really important that people understand that TABOR's not really benefiting everybody. And I don't even know if it's benefiting that small few that think they are getting that benefit. And when you think of the whole, right, of that it's created such a burden on education, on small business, on transportation, I mean, healthcare, you know, the list is endless. And now we have COVID. I mean, when everyone was talking about these issues in February, no one even thought about a pandemic. And now we have a pandemic to deal with on top of everything else. So, yeah, I know there's no easy answers, but I think if anyone can explain these issues to us, it's you.
But
So
your example is great, and my friend Bill Becker is on, and I'm sure he would agree with what you were talking about. We are overrepresented in our economy compared to other states with small businesses, and I think that's a great thing. I think this is why we love Colorado so much. But I talked about that 45-55 split, and the fact that the assessment rate when it first started, Gallagher first started, was 21% for residential and 29% for business. Well, that 29% is actually written in. I mean, it's locked in, but the residential assessment rate floats, and it has floated downward because the assessed value of houses has increased much more rapidly in the state of Colorado than the assessed rate for assessed valuation for businesses. So now it's sitting at, I think, a little bit above 7%, which means that small businesses, well, all businesses are paying about 4, maybe more than 4 times the amount for similar assessed amount of property. So your example of a $1 million home versus $1 million business, which they both sound luxurious, but I think the business footage and sometimes the cost of those things is much higher too. For a business to be paying 4 or more times the property tax, when I tell people that, they go, yeah, that's not a problem. They can just take that and pass that along to the consumer. The problem is it's a level playing field if 2 businesses are competing within the same, like, say, school district, right? Then it's a level playing field. But most businesses, they compete across district lines and state lines. And so if they're trying to compete against a business that does not have to pay those high rates of property tax, they end up having to eat it out of their profit. And employees get paid less, and the owner makes less money, and eventually just becomes an untenable equation for everybody to move forward as a business. So, that's the piece that I don't think people completely understand, but it really has put a huge amount on these business owners. And I admire when, for example, we had this big bond election in Greeley, and the Greeley Chamber and other chambers came out in favor of that. I know those business owners had to swallow hard, but they really took a hard look at the district, and they as community members valued that. But boy, they ended up paying 4 times plus over what residential property tax were paying in order to fund that increase. Now,
but that took them at least three tries, though.
Right.
I mean, and it took a lot of,
well, that was the mill levy. That was
members.
The mill levy override. This was the bond. I mean, the last bond that they had passed was when I was first coming in as a House representative, and it was for a best matching grant, and it was $8 million. And it was hotly argued in Greeley, almost didn't pass, So I was astounded when, the superintendent, who I think is just fantastic, Deirdre Pilch, has done a wonderful job. And she really made the case with everybody in the community that our infrastructure for our school district was really suffering. And if we didn't do something now, we'd be paying the price in the future. So, I mean, that was a tough conversation, and everybody had to swallow hard and look at it and really stop being partisan and just sit down and think about their community in order to get it done. So we went from an $8 million bond to a $400 million bond, and we are moving our district back into being a quality school district as a result of it. Also passed the mill levy override for the first time in the history of the district as well under her leadership. And so been a lot of good work done there. But there's now the prospect that because of increased assessed valuation, that residential assessment rate is going to have to go down from where it's at right now, a little above 7%, down to, I think the number was 5.88. So now we're talking about more than 5 times if that happens. So we're going from 4 times to 5 times the amount that businesses are paying. I mean, it's a never-ending battle here. And so there is a move afoot in the legislature to refer a measure to the ballot, and it's got bipartisan support, to repeal Gallagher out of the Constitution. And you know, I think it's pretty amazing we're having this conversation, that it's a bipartisan conversation. I do believe that there's still going to be that lingering conversation with actual taxpayers. And I had one the other day. It's a person who's a senior citizen on a fixed income, and said, you know what, I need to know what that's actually going to look like. If we take Gallagher out, are my property taxes going to explode again because I'm on a fixed income and I can't afford a large increase in my property taxes? I'm going to be—
And that's valid.
It is. It's totally valid. I'm going to be making a decision between prescriptions and taxes and food. And, you know, I mean, these are really intense conversations. These are not theoretical. This is where the pragmatism really has to kick in, and people have to think through this. So that's why I made that comment that, you know, if we start tinkering with these things, we need to have a very clear plan for what is our tax policy going to be in the state of Colorado. And I'm not sure we've had those in-depth conversations yet. I'm more than happy to have that conversation. You know, people shudder a little bit, particularly in Weld County, when I talk about severance tax, and particularly now because we've got such a really difficult situation in the oil and gas industry with the oil prices, which are coming back up again. But we had a glut of Saudi oil as the Russians and the Saudis were fighting, and price of oil plummeted. It had nothing to do with anything that we had done legislatively here in the state. This was an international play that resulted in oil prices dropping dramatically, and we've seen the fallout from that across Weld County, certainly. But you know, as we think about other states that have extractive industries, and I'll pick one just directly north of us, Wyoming. I had an interesting conversation with the treasurer of Wyoming, Kirk Meyer. He and I both came into office at the same time, and you know, we both manage a permanent fund. Permanent fund is built for public schools, to the benefit of public schools. It's part of what most states in the West agreed to when they became states and their negotiations with the federal government. Certain parcels of land across the state are set aside for the benefit of schools, and whatever revenue you get for those goes into this permanent fund. We have grazing rights, and certainly have mineral rights and everything else that go into that. We have lease rights. We own property in the middle of downtown Denver, and lease proceeds go into that permanent fund as well. Obviously, in Wyoming, you know, they have a really huge extractive industry. I mean, that's a big part of their economy up there. And Kirk was telling me that back in the early 70s, they had $80 in their permanent fund. $80 in their permanent fund. Currently, we have $1 billion in our permanent fund, and people go, whoa, that's a lot of money. But in a moment, I'll come back and tell you why that's really seems like a lot of money, but it isn't really quite enough. But the state of Wyoming, you know, has about 1/10 the population that we do, and their permanent fund went from $80 in the early 70s, and it now is $20.5 billion. $20.5 billion. Now,
where do we go wrong?
Well, their severance tax is their effective severance tax rate is about 9 times what ours is. And
yeah, I agree.
You know,
I think severance.
What Kurt,
yeah.
Well, what Kurt did is he said, you know, we didn't want to. I mean, the extraction industry is a huge amount of our economy, so we have to be very careful about our tax policy. We don't want to tax to the point where we kill the goose that laid the golden egg. I mean, that's our economy. But I think they had a frank and honest conversation with a successful business entity or sector in their economy, and said we need to come up with a better plan here, because our public services are just being decimated, and that can't go on. We need to make sure our state stays whole. And so, you know, they don't have an income tax, and people who are residents of Wyoming go to college without tuition. I mean, there's some good spin-offs for that. Kurt will be the first person to say there's still some problems with the way they configured it, and that certainly they're struggling just like every other state that's dependent on extraction in this crisis. So, I mean, you can't lean on one sector alone you really have to have a thoughtful, broad-based approach to this to say, look, we want our economy to be strong, but we also need to have strong public services that meet the needs, the real needs of people, so that we can move forward. And we're not doing that right now.
I think to address the severance tax, a lot of people think, well, why don't we just increase the severance tax? And the thing is the way that that's set up here in our state also doesn't really, it would not help us because of the carbon tax with you know what I mean? Like, it's not, they get a tax credit, but it's not really actual money, right? And the counties are not even looking at severance tax as actual hard money that they can, appropriate to certain things like infrastructure. So it's just kind of like, oh, here's this little bit of gravy that we get, and we're going to put that aside because we really, we don't know what we're going to get, if anything. And right now, we're looking at severance tax going, with what we get back, even less than what we bid, So, I know in Weld County, Weld RE5J, we've benefited from the oil and gas industry for our school district. But again, we're looking at things that have not had attention for 20 years. So when we try to do a bond or a mill levy, it almost passed. So now we're looking to do it again. We had to surrender an $8.3 million BEST grant, which
I know that very well. I watched that play out in real time.
Frustrating. And the thing is that now when you think about it, it's like some of the conversations we would have with community members is, well, why do we need to do that? We've got oil and gas. Oil and gas gives us this money. And I said, yes, but we cannot rely on one industry to take care of the things that we need to thrive in the future.
We keep talking about the fact that Colorado has one of the hottest economies in the country, and it's not just oil and gas that's contributed to that. There is a very, very strong tech sector that's been highly successful. There's been a very, very strong healthcare sector as well. The financial services sector is, I have close working relationships with them on a daily basis, and I know they've done well. We don't want to create tax policies that create problems for their success. But at the same time, if we are creating problems in our public service sector to deliver essential services, we have to do kind of a global look at this and sit down and really figure it out. And so that's a tough conversation to have. It's certainly a really difficult conversation to have in the middle of a financial crisis, but I mean, it's one that I'm committed to carry forward in a thoughtful way. Interestingly, a group of us, the executive director of the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, the governor's budget writing office, and the controller, Bob Jaros. Lauren Larson's the executive director of OSPB. Bob's the controller. I'm the treasurer. Lauren said, let's form a CFO's council. We don't have any formal thing that would pull people together to talk about these financial issues, but she said, why don't we get together? And we've been meeting now for over a year. And amazingly, one of the things that we flagged as an important thing that we needed to do was to create a rainy day fund. And so we were actually working with the Joint Budget Committee on legislation and presented to them in December. And they pulled bill titles to move forward a rainy day fund in, I think it was either January or February. And then boom, here we are in another recession and financial crisis. And we don't have the ability to set aside any money again because it's all being pulled in out of the reserves to just try to fill a huge gaping $3.3 billion hole in the budget, which it's not doing successfully. So, we're still making the point with the Joint Budget Committee that as we begin to recover, that we need to begin to implement that sort of thing. And we need to start to think about other ways that we should be recovering as well. And, this whole conversation can be a kind of a Debbie Downer kind of thing, because it's like, oh, our Constitution has kind of got us in a bind, and we're in a bind with a big pandemic and a financial crisis and an oil and gas crisis, and everything looks a little bleak. We're cutting the budget, but if you don't start talking about recovery right now, we're all going to end up having to face budget cuts year after year after year. You gotta help the economy get going again. And certainly there'll be just some natural things that will happen that will make that happen. But I think that there are things that we can do as a state to help facilitate that, and have been working on it.
So in regards to that, so right now the JBC is working on the long bill, and
Almost
so
done.
I wanted to ask you about this. The legislature
Yeah.
faces major spending cuts in the $30 billion budget with the withdrawal. This is where this is, you know, some of the priorities that we worked so hard to put in place in the past years. And so they're going to do, you know, with a withdrawal from recent priorities on suicide prevention, school safety, opioid treatment, and conservation programs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so how does,
Right.
so when we think about that, how does the recovery plans that you're privy to, like you're discussing with the legislatures, how does that, what does that look like?
Okay.
And then not to mention the high rate of unemployment that's happening right now.
Right. Right. Well, and that's why I say we're going to be cutting the budget going into the future. If you think about the loss of income that people are experiencing now, and the fact that in a year from now, or a little less than a year now from now, they're going to be paying their income taxes on that, we're going to be talking about less income taxes coming in a year from now. So not only did they have to cut the budget now, but they're going to have to cut the budget again because incomes are way down. And of course, when incomes are down, then people are not going out and buying things. And so sales taxes are down. And that not only affects the state, but it also affects local entities as well. And, you know, so Greeley city government and so on are really affected as well. And Johnstown, Milliken, and all those small towns in your Senate district are really affected by this. And so the state gets, I think it's somewhere between 85 and 87% of its revenue comes from sales and income tax. And so when those are both down significantly a year from now, guess what? Their joint budget committee is going to be cutting again, and maybe cutting even more than they did this time. They had to cut somewhere around 21+% of the general fund, and they may be looking at an amount higher than that. We may be looking at a general fund that is 50% of what it was in 2 years. So,
well, and that's because we can't, and there's nothing being paid into it,
right,
to compensate.
So the solution to the recovery is a number of different things. We need some help from our federal partners at this point, and there's been a strong resistance in the U.S. Senate to bringing money directly into state and local governments. I mentioned that we can't print money. They can. And in a crisis of this magnitude, that is really where the revenue should be coming from. Certainly, we as taxpayers have to pay that back, but the Constitution does not allow, U.S. Constitution does not allow a state or a local entity to print money. So we have to look to our federal partners to do that. And when you have a chamber that balks and says, no, we'll just wait and see what happens. And oh, by the way, if you can't make it, just as a state, just declare bankruptcy, which is also illegal by the U.S. Constitution. It's just not helpful. So, you know, we want pragmatism here. We want to make sure we work through this. So certainly the federal government has played a role in this. And I'll come back in a moment and talk about that sort of thing. But there are some things that we can do to stimulate our economy here in Colorado, because if we can keep small businesses particularly viable and moving forward, we know that they keep their communities alive. I mean, this is the backbone of these small communities. And people have jobs. When they have jobs, they can pay taxes. And that's the revenue flow, the natural revenue flow that occurs. There's going to be some recovery just in the natural way for some of these businesses. As a matter of fact, some of these small businesses aren't impacted at all. They're thriving because they just happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right business model. You know, I think about these food delivery companies and things like that. They're making out like crazy on this particular situation. So good for
innovation.
Them. That is innovation. So there'll be pieces of that. We should always be, you know, supporting innovation. You know, I think that's what led to our better recovery coming out of the 2008-2009 recession, was that the state really incentivized innovation and really pushed, particularly in the tech sector, for a lot of innovation that that we point now to and say that startup mentality is what drove us forward to have one of the hottest economies in the country. But the governor, Jared Polis, who I think has done a fantastic job in this crisis, early on reached out to business leaders across the state and said, I would love to set up a council for recovery. And he created, and I can never get the name right, but it's the governor's Economic Stabilization and Recovery Council, something like that. It's about recovery. And he asked Federico Pena, former U.S. Secretary of Transportation and Mayor of Denver, and former state representative and senator. I guess he was the chair of or served on the House Finance Committee at one point 40 years ago. I discovered yesterday. He asked Federico to come in and be the chair of that council, and then brought in all these other business leaders and said, please serve on chairs of subcommittees. And so one of the subcommittees was around financial services, and they asked me to come in and work on that financial services subcommittee as well. And one of the first things we realized had to happen is we needed to support our small businesses. And right away, the U.S. Treasury and the Small Business Administration and Congress put in a significant amount of money, hundreds of billions of dollars, for a program that they have called the Paycheck Protection Program. And it was a lightning fast implementation to try to get money directly into small businesses so that they could keep their employees on the payroll. They could make payments on key things like utilities and rent or mortgage interest, so that the business could stay at least temporarily viable while we figure out the health crisis. Certainly, there's some flaws in that program, and there's things that have to be done. But when you stand up a program of that magnitude, and I think it was well over $600 billion so far has been put into that, there's going to be some flaws and some errors that are made. But the Financial Services Subcommittee really focused in on this heavily. We worked with lenders, both the large lenders, the community bank lenders, and the credit unions, brought them all together, which is kind of a feat in and of itself, because there's sometimes contention between those three groups, but they all work cooperatively. We worked with chambers of commerce, the small business development centers, and the SBA regional director, who is Dan Norberg, who used to serve with me in the House, and officials in Washington. And actually, the good news, I think we brought in somewhere approaching $8 billion of PPP money into the state of Colorado. And that's money that wasn't there before. Unfortunately, not all businesses were able to get a loan. And as a result of that, we have many businesses that are still struggling. There wasn't a lot of good guidance that was given, and some businesses that got the loans are now rethinking whether or not they should keep them. The loans only last for, the money has to be expended within 2.5 months. And, we're still struggling trying to figure that out. And it's that health crisis out, and it's a narrow band of expenditures that they can put the money to, and businesses need a bit more flexibility if they're really going to address some of these issues. So one of the chairs of that subcommittee, Blair Richardson, who I spoke about earlier, had this vision of a $250 million small business fund that we could stand up here specifically for Colorado small businesses, and see if we could provide a little broader support for them, a little bit more thoughtful support, particularly as we come out of the health crisis, and they need support for working capital. You think about a restaurant that's lost their entire inventory, and yeah, they want to be able to pay their employees, but they've also got to stand up all this food that is, they couldn't put out the door, or they had to send to food banks. They've got to, they need some working capital to get up and running again. We know that the PPP was important because if you don't sustain businesses in some way or another, the employees scatter the wind. The building is lost that they were in. I mean, it goes vacant. All the fixtures that were in there are sold off, and it's really hard for a business to stand back up again. So this new business loan program, it's called Climber, and everybody's got to have an acronym, right? Climber is a loan program, and I can't remember what that acronym stands for either, but it's a recovery loan program for small businesses. The House bill that goes with it which we took to the House Finance Committee yesterday, is House Bill 20-1413. And we had bipartisan support and support across the state for this bill and this program. That bill passed in Finance Committee 11-0 yesterday. And so, yeah, we're very pleased, but it requires $50 million of first loss money from the state. And, you know, when you're cutting the budget by $3.3 billion, for us to come in and say we need $50 million of first loss money out of the general fund is laughable. You know, I couldn't even, with a straight face, come in and ask anybody for that, because it's, you know, not possible. What we discovered was that there's a tax that we already assess on insurance premiums, particularly for life insurance, very stable tax. It's already in existence. And there was a program back in the early 2000s that sold tax credits on that insurance premium tax credit. I'm sorry, get my terms mixed up. They sold tax credits on the insurance premium tax back to insurance companies at a discount in order to get the tax money up front. So, you know, please give us your money now, and then you can claim the credit later. We're going to sell that tax credit at a discount so that you're incentivized to buy it, but it gives us the money up front now. They did $10 million a year in the early 2000s for a decade. They did $10 million a year for 10 years. And so we've got a system that is tried and true. We know it works. You know, we walked the Finance Committee all the way through that. They understood it, and both sides of the aisle said, yeah, that's not going to impact our general fund now. When they claim those credits 5, 6, 7 years down the road, certainly we have to pay it back out of the general fund. But if we're smart about our recovery, our general fund should be recovered by then. As a matter of fact, we may be in a TABOR refund situation by then, and claiming those tax credits wouldn't actually have any impact to the general fund at all. So it's an interesting concept. We really want to focus on concessionary loans to small businesses that are better than market rate, that provide that working capital to businesses that are around 10 to 100 employees. We have another, the Office of Economic Development and International Trade has another smaller loan program. It's actually more like a grant program where they're focusing on those really small businesses, 20 or under. And there's a little overlap there, but not a lot. We don't want any businesses falling into a hole like we did with the PPP program. And we really want to be utilizing our lenders in the community. And the state doesn't want to do this. We want to hire a third-party administrator like CHAFA or someone with other financial experience to actually set the conditions of the loans and work with lenders to make sure that they're done appropriately. So this is a good public-private partnership that I think we're proposing, and is certainly, you know, there's going to be recovery, but this is a way to actually precipitate that, move that forward in a faster fashion, so that we can keep these small businesses alive. So that's moving quickly, really quickly. We've put a huge amount of time into it in order to stand it up. It started based on something that both Federico and Blair had seen happen in Chicago. Chicago had a $100 million small business loan program that they were standing up. Their population size is about the same as Colorado's. And so they said, oh, you know, 100 million, we can do better than that. We can do 250 million. So we're on the pathway to do that. We're going to do it in 5 tranches of 50 million apiece. And we're going to take each tranche and analyze how it's working, and make adjustments to the way the loan program works. So it's really, we know that it's helping small businesses for the needs that they have. So really pleased that it was hard getting there, getting that legislation to really be viable, but I think we've captured it. So between the PPP program, this really small grant program, and this one, I think we're making some steps. The sad news in all of this, that's great news that we're doing that. The sad news is the need is far greater than any of those numbers add up to. And so the governor and I wrote a letter to the congressional delegation based on feedback that we have gotten from the small businesses across the state and the lenders with chock full of suggestions on how to improve the PPP program. 6 pages of recommendations. And to his credit, Senator Bennett actually picked up that letter and told his staff, let's write a bill and let's get bipartisan sponsorship to run a fix to the PPP program. And so he paired up with another Young, not me, but Todd Young, who's a Republican U.S. Senator out of Indiana, and they created the Restart Program bill that is designed to try to implement those suggestions that the governor and I put forward to them. There are other bills that look like they're working their way through the Senate and the House as well. The Restart bill may not be the one that ultimately they go with, but at least those ideas are out there and people are taking a good hard look at it. So I think, this is what you want your policymakers to do. You want them to keep coming back and trying to make things work better and better and better. And I just feel like that there's a lot of momentum, got a lot of good work going on right now in a bipartisan way. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we're bipartisan. What we have to have is something that works. And so I have been working with, send an email to Pro 15, which is, kind of a conglomeration of our 15 Weld County partners or not Weld County, but 15 counties, including Weld County up here in northern Colorado, working with Action 22 down in the southern part of the state and Club 20 on the western slope. Club 20 is taking a position of support already. I did a podcast for Action 22 that they're putting out to their membership. I'm sure at some point I'll talk to Kathy Shull. NCLA certainly would weigh in on this, I would imagine, Bill, right? And so, I think at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to hear from businesses and lenders and communities as we start to do the first and second tranches of this work under the 1413 bill to see if it's really working. And we can always monitor and adjust as we go forward to make sure the implementation works for everybody.
One of the things I really love about how this was initiated is that all the stakeholders were brought to the table, even though it was a hard conversation. You hashed through it to come to a win-win or a compromise where, we're going to have some sort of solution. And I think that that's been lost in a lot of politics, and we need to bring that back. We don't all agree on things, and but sometimes when we sit down with other perspectives, we create amazing policy. And so that's one of the things I loved about your story was, and moving forward.
There's another bill that I've been working on for some time, and it's around retirement savings. And we know that people are not saving enough and they're not prepared for retirement. As a matter of fact, we've discovered in this downturn how little people are saving at all for anything and really are in crisis as a result of it. And somewhere along the line, my parents were a strong believer in saving versus debt. They were depression babies. My mom often used to say that she would just love to take her money and bury it in tin cans in the backyard. And I kept telling her, please, Mom, stop talking about that. You're going to wake up to a backhoe in your backyard someday where somebody's thinking that you are really serious about that. But they really believed in earning interest, not paying interest. And it was a mantra that they drilled into me. And we've really been trying to figure out this retirement savings problem that we have. When people aren't ready for retirement and we know Social Security is not enough, they end up stressing out our safety net services in retirement when that shouldn't happen. And who pays for all those safety net services? Well, taxpayers do. So, it's better to get on the front end of this thing. We actually did 4 studies in the past year to actually figure out the best plan forward. And as a result of that study, those 4 studies, we have come up with another bill that I've been pushing forward in the legislature, Senate Bill 200. Senate Bill 200 this go around. And we are actually pushing forward the opportunity to put a workplace retirement savings auto IRA program in. We don't want to do this in a way, particularly as small businesses are recovering. We don't want to do this in a way that really impacts their ability to recover. But we also want to start encouraging people to save so that when they are ready to retire, they have the resources they need to be sustainable in retirement without leaning on safety net services unnecessarily. So I think what's been difficult with that is that the board that I chaired over the past year that's been working on this is not partisan. There was no partisanship involved there, but I know that some of them are Democrats, and I know that some of them are Republicans, and we all came together with a unanimous decision that this was the right way to go. And again, that decision had nothing to do with politics. It wasn't partisan at all. It was really just looking at the facts and saying we need to do this. Unfortunately, the bill is not bipartisan, and I wish we could get there, because I really honestly believe that we need to solve this problem. I know some are saying we should just wait until Congress solves it. Not holding my breath. But we've patterned this after several successful programs. One, particularly in the state of Oregon, that has implemented an auto enroll IRA program for citizens in their state. We matched that up against a program up in the state of Washington that was kind of a voluntary approach. It's almost like the health insurance exchange. You go to a website, you see all the plans that are out there, and you just voluntarily pick one and enroll in it. They both implemented in 2017. Right now, the state of Washington has 300 people saving for retirement as a result of that voluntary marketplace program. And the state of Oregon, with their auto enroll program, has 60,000 savers and growing exponentially. And so we know that providing that it's kind of an opt-out thing. So you're automatically enrolled, and then you can choose to opt out. Seems to work better to get people started. And boy, what a great time to start saving money. Once people get jobs back and these businesses become viable again, and we can facilitate this through the businesses in a way to get people starting to save now. The markets are down, so they can take those savings and start to invest in a down market and let them grow. So I think some of the stakeholders in that one were thinking, oh, well, everything's so bad, we'll just try again next year. And I got pretty animated, said, no, we should work this. And so that bill actually got through the Senate and passed, and is heading to the House. So we're trying, and these are all recovery efforts. It's all about recovery now. The legislature's got to focus on the cuts and the deficits, but some of us have to focus on the recovery, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, thank you so much. I want to go through some of the questions before I let you go. Is that okay?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you got to cut me off. I'll just keep yakking here.
And then I wanted to just briefly touch on Initiative 271.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so first question is from Lynn. What is the best argument to get people to vote correctly on the amendments in November? And where is Lynn?
Lynn's there. Yeah.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Sally. Hi, Dave.
Hi,
Lynn.
Can you expand on that?
Well, when we have our discussions, say like even with a neighbor, and it's mainly about the protection of their income, whether it's through hoping taxes are not raised or various price raises they see in the basic economy, but it's hard to pin down a concrete, a real tangible reason that makes sense. That, to me, having studied these issues for all these years, I love politics, for all these years. So I understand long-range policy. And I believe in long-range policy, like if we can get rid of TABOR, and in the long range, then provide adequate budgets with reasoning. But this issue of just trying to shorthand everything I've just said and to get them to at least ask a question, and then what would the answer be to that? So it's a shorthand way of getting people to even have a conversation about the amendments, TABOR,
Great, thank you.
TABOR, et cetera.
Well, let me connect that to 271, because I'm a strong supporter of Initiative 271. But I know that any conversation about tax policy is always fraught with lots of questions, and I raised those questions at the beginning. What's life going to be like on the other side if you take TABOR and Gallagher out of the Constitution completely? Initiative 271 actually does amend TABOR, but it doesn't delete TABOR, but it does change the tax policy, and it actually provides a tax cut for, I believe, about 95% of income earners, but it does introduce a progressive tax so that those at the upper ends of incomes end up paying more than the flat tax that they're paying now. And so it's going to be a discussion. I'm sure it's going to be a very vigorous discussion if it gets on the ballot. Let's see. Well, it's backwards, isn't it? I'm a petition gatherer, a carrier for Amendment 271. It's fairtaxcolorado.org, and people can go to that website and actually learn more about it. But I have my petitions here that came in the mail, and I know it's difficult in this time of the coronavirus to contemplate getting out there and what protections you need to provide for petition signers to make sure that you're not transmitting that virus to them. So I'm very cognizant of that. One of the people that I work with very closely on these issues is Lisa Weil. Lisa Weil is the executive director of Great Education Colorado, and she just does a fabulous job. The other reason why I like Lisa Weil is that she was an 8th grade student of mine at Heath Junior High way back in the day. I won't give the year because she hates it when I do that, because then everybody can figure out her age when I do that, which is not nice of me. But I'm older than her. I don't know. What's the deal? Anyway, but what I fondly say is, who knew that as an 8th grader, Lisa Weil was cultivating me to be state treasurer of the state of Colorado. So anyway, it's, I think what I love about the effort that Lisa has pursued, and this is not the only one that she has pursued, Amendment 73, which started as Initiative 93 2 years ago, was also another effort that they put forward, and it's a grassroots effort. And really, I think, Lynn, you're exactly right. It's those things that people have to do in over the back fence conversations, backyard fence conversations with people that really make a difference. It's not big top-down media campaigns. We've seen that on Amendment 66 and most recently on Proposition BB. those big media top-down things don't work. It's these community conversations that people have, just like what you're doing here, Sally, that really give people a chance to probe the depths of these issues and argue back and forth respectfully, yes, whether or not they agree with them. And if they don't, why, and maybe they do, and how do I get involved and move it forward,
Yeah, how do I learn more? Exactly.
Right.
So our next question comes from Charles. What or who is Gallagher?
Gallagher actually is the name of a state senator, Dennis Gallagher, who eventually, after he left the state Senate, at one point was the auditor for the city and county of Denver. He's been very involved in politics for a long time, and I'm trying to remember the name. There was another state senator who worked very closely with Dennis Gallagher, and name was right on the top of my head, but they're still both very active. When we were talking about Amendment 73 and Initiative 93 2 years ago, I went and had breakfast in Longmont with Dennis Gallagher and this other former state senator, because it was going to impact some aspects of the Gallagher Amendment as well. And so, I would imagine that you'll see some activism from Dennis Gallagher and others in this conversation about whether or not to repeal the Gallagher Amendment as this gets into the public sphere.
Great. Now the next question is also from Charles. With burning fossil fuels causing climate change problems and a high severance tax in Wyoming, shouldn't Colorado raise its severance tax? Well, we addressed that. I think we did. Charles, do you feel like we addressed that, Charles? Let me unmute you. Well, how would you like us to expand on that?
There's a segment of the population that's quite concerned about climate change. There's a segment of the population that denies that climate change is happening. But it just strikes me that if, for example, Wyoming has a rather high severance tax, and this state is a neighbor to Wyoming, it's sort of like we're missing out on an opportunity.
Well, in fact, I think that was on the ballot at one point and was defeated. So it's not like it hasn't been tried before. I do believe that, one sector of the economy really can't carry all the load here. And so when I've had conversations with the oil and gas industry, they said, yeah, we're willing to be a partner in this, but it can't all be on us to solve this economic crisis that we have. And I articulated many other segments or sectors of our economy that we ought to be bringing to the table and having a shared conversation with all of them about how we solve this fiscal mess that we have and supporting public services here in Colorado. Sally alluded to the fact that we've created some very complex tax code in the area. It's not just severance tax, but it's ad valorem, and it's a lot of different aspects to the tax code around oil and gas that would have to get sorted out. But
right, because currently the way the severance tax works, it's not really benefiting us. Even if we did try to raise it, I don't see how that would benefit us. In the way that we would like it to when we look at Wyoming, right? We should have had that conversation prior. I don't know. I think we have to address TABOR and Gallagher, and then, depending on what the industry looks like, it is a bust and boom industry. I think it depends on what it looks like to even revisit severance tax at this point, right? We should be moving forward into more forward-thinking industries as well, to make a just transition for the workers and for our environment. But that's another subject now.
I don't hear the business community being resistant to having these conversations. Again, I just think when you single one out and say you're the one we want to have be the one that supports everything, right, then they start getting they're feeling like it's not a shared community effort in that aspect. So I really
agree with that.
Yeah, I think it's really incumbent on our political leaders, our policymakers, to really bring everybody, as Sally you talked about, stakeholders together in order to be able to do that, so that it's really a good conversation then, and not one that's just pointing out one particular sector. But are we doing everything we can? I don't know. I think policymakers get a little run down trying to make this happen as well. So we've got to figure it out, though. We're the ones that are elected to make it happen.
And right before I let you go, I did have one other question in regards to other industries. One of the other one of my other priorities for economic development moving forward is industrial hemp. What has been the conversations in regards to the banking situation?
Interestingly, the whole, so Ed Perlmutter, our congressman for Congressional District 7, put forward a marijuana banking bill, the SAFE Act, to try to take this this money that's running around this cash that's running around publicly on the street, and move it into the banking system. I think it's getting a little better reception than it has in previous times that it's been introduced, but it's still a struggle. The problem that we have, and of course hemp gets pulled into this because the way the laws are written and shouldn't be, they say hemp is the same as marijuana, even though if you work really hard at hemp to lower the amount of THC, it's a completely different product. But it was interesting. I belong to a national organization, the Treasury does, and I do individually, the National Association of State Treasurers. And the former president of NAST, it's kind of an odd acronym, National Association of State Treasurer, last year was David Damschen, who's the treasurer of Utah. And he's a moderate Republican treasurer. And when Ed Perlmutter introduced his bill, David Damschen pushed through a resolution from NAST to support that bill. And he said, this has nothing to do with the legalization of marijuana. This has to do with having our communities be safe. And he says,
Yes.
we as treasurers should always want to make sure that our public is safe. And these large amounts of cash running around in communities is just a bad policy. And it was very contentious, but I admired his leadership. And I think it's going to take more people like that stepping forward. He has a banking background. That's what he did before he got into politics and ran for state treasurer. And I like him very much. I think he's a good leader. And I had a front row seat my first year as treasurer to watching him move that agenda forward. And it was tough. I mean, there's some states that don't agree at all with recreational marijuana. We see that in the national dialogue, and we actually had some states threaten to drop their membership in that organization if this resolution passed. I don't think they actually did, but I mean, it was that kind of contentious conversation, but he facilitated it well. We got a resolution to support it, and we are still working with our federal partners to change that. Ultimately, I think many people believe that recreational marijuana and everything else needs to be descheduled, and that really does solve that problem. But man, if you can't even get a Safe Banking Act passed, it's pretty tough. It really is.
And I think that, other states are going to be, implementing this anyway. I mean, I think eventually we're going to see all the states on board with legalizing hemp and then marijuana.
Right.
Because
it's the same thing with the retirement savings.
Revenue. Yeah.
The states are the incubators of these policies, and they move the policy forward, and the federal government will probably catch up with us. But waiting on them to do it is very difficult. But
one last question.
Sure.
Shouldn't the voters have a major voice in determining what government spends? This is a couple parts here. So consider states like Illinois, where politicians generated huge unfunded pension liabilities. Consider San Jose, California, that had short career durations and high pensions for public servants.
Well, I do think that the public has very much a say in that. It depends on who you elect to office. And, I know I will say something pretty controversial, perhaps, but I don't believe in term limits at all. And I think we have an election for State House every 2 years, and we have an election for State Senate every 4 years. Same with the governors, Attorney General, State Treasurer, and Secretary of State. And the reason that I say that is because those are the people that you send to formulate policy. And if they're not if they're not making these expenditure decisions the way you like, then put somebody in there, support a candidate, and put somebody in there that will. But when you artificially remove somebody from the process, here's what you create. After 8 years, somebody is forced to relinquish their position, and then you get another fresh face that comes in. And it takes really 3 to 4 years for any elected official to become well-versed in how all these things work. I will tell you, I got on the Joint Budget Committee after 3 years in the legislature, and that first year on Joint Budget Committee was hair-raising. I used to have a lot more hair. It took me a couple of years, even on Joint Budget Committee, to really understand the financials of the state budget-wise. And now I've been in treasurer's position for almost a year and a half now. Now I'm understanding the nuts and bolts of the cash flow of the state as well. But it takes a long time to really acquire that expertise.
And that's why it's so hard for us to have, for us to talk about it amongst ourselves unless we have. Right. Something that we, like a 1 page or something like that. Colorado Fair Tax has actually on their website. They do offer 1 page so that you can start a conversation. And I think that moving forward, that's where we begin. So on that note,
guess who isn't term limited?
Who?
The lobbyists. Some of them, I know, I'm working with a couple now that have been there for over 40 years. they're well versed in all this, and
And sometimes they're very helpful because they have a lot of knowledge in certain areas.
Some of them can be. Some of them can be very detrimental, depending on what the issue is. But they're all very well versed. That's also our elected
officials as well, right? I mean,
well, they're all very well. But yeah, but the problem is that you can replace an ineffective legislator if you really mount a good campaign. You can't do that with a lobbyist. They're there. And if they fulfill the job that they were hired to do, they stay in there. And every 2, 4, 6, or 8 years, there's a new person coming in, and they really, because they're not term limited, they run rings around those fresh faces. And I just don't think that's really what people who support term limits envisioned as the outcome of that conversation, was that they would be in a less productive position than every other aspect of the political process, but they are as a result of term limits. I don't, until we fix that.
The other thing too about term limits, especially on the House side, is that, you're just getting your momentum, and next thing you know, you're up for re-election.
Right.
So,
right. And I don't know how U.S. representatives do it. It's tough enough as a state representative, but a U.S. representative, we have stacked the deck against their ability to really be effective as representatives of us, and God love them for doing the work we do. I think we have great ones here in the state of Colorado, but boy, it's a tough job. So,
well, thank you so much. This has been so informative, and I really appreciate you spending time with us.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I hope to do this again with you. We just had some people asking, like, I hope Dave does this again.
Oh, I'd love to do it. You bet. Yeah, well, you just can't shut me up, can you? The nice thing is, if it's town hall and it's in person, you can always get up and walk out. Well, it's even easier on Zoom. You just click the button, I'm gone, But I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm, as you can tell, very passionate about these things. And I think it's these conversations that really are going to make a difference. So I appreciate all of you coming on the call and the Zoom and participating in it. My email address is dave.young.
I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, you're putting it in the chat? Okay. Dave.young at state.co.us. And so for policy position questions, you can send them to me if you didn't get them answered here. My political address, if it's a political question, which I don't use state resources to work through, is dave@daveyoungforcolorado.com. So I really work hard to keep the political and the policy separate.
Is it Dave Young for Colorado?
Yeah, dave@daveyoungforcolorado.com. So I know on an event like this where you're a candidate for office, sometimes there's political questions, and we've talked a lot about policy as well. So I'm happy to entertain both. I just try to keep them separate so we don't mix them.
Okay, great. Oh, I need to put that for everybody. Hold on. Okay. Give me a moment. Put that in for everybody.
So I do love the Zoom stuff. I taught online for CU Denver for about a decade and utilized tools like this. I actually taught people how to teach online. So
really?
Yeah, so I this is like old home week here. I get to come back and do the work I used to do before I got in the legislature, but it's a good communications tool. I was on a town hall with Representative McLaughlin down in the Durango, La Plata County area, a couple of different ones. And so it's really nice to be able to bridge these big statewide expanses by utilizing a tool like this. So, and by the way, our entire department, a very small but mighty force of 33 staff members are all working remotely and have conquered these tech tools as well in order for us to be able to do our work in the Treasury. So we're really leveraging our technology these days.
And I also wanted to mention too, as a follow-up, a lot of people are probably interested in Initiative 271. Next week, I will have Carol Hedges, who is the executive director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute.
Nice.
She will be talking to us about the Initiative 271 and how we can get involved and how we can have these conversations with our neighbors and friends to get this on the ballot, and how it will benefit us. And it really won't affect Tabor. If you think about it, it's a really beautiful thing. And
it
she will explain
it tweaks Tabor.
It's a good thing. And I mean, the benefits are like, I think they said 2 million. So that's incredible.
Yeah, it's education and transportation. So I mean, these are the two things that I think are really on top of mind for a lot of people. By the way, we issued $500 million of transportation COPs earlier this week. And
wow. We don't hear that in the news.
Well, we didn't put it in the news yet. It's coming. We got a really great deal on the rates, 2.13%, and we actually got a premium. Investors paid us more than we wanted for the issuance, so we ended up getting over $600 million in on the deal, and a really great interest rate on top of it. So we're doing great work in the Treasury. The person that drove forward that issuance is a guy by the name of Eric Rothaus. He is the deputy treasurer of the state, and he also grew up in Greeley. So, what can I say? It's always Northern Colorado. We make it happen, right?
Yeah, we are. That's right. We bring people together and we get things done.
Exactly. Now you're talking.
Well,
Great.
Thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed today and learned a lot. And if you have any questions or any follow-up, please do not hesitate to reach out to me and or Dave, and we will get back to you. So thanks so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
You too, Sally. You too, everybody. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.